is to actually identify the impaired water segments in the county. DEQ, through various reporting and testing, has identified impaired waters and the impairments to those waters. We think that that was good information, and the general public should have that information, and the board have that information when you're considering issues before you. So we have added this section on impaired waters to help with our planning efforts. We also have expanded our discussion of potential pollution sources and measures to mitigate that. And again, we discussed the Dawn decentralized wastewater treatment in detail in terms of how it has positively benefited the county and the protection of our groundwater resources. We also highlight our environmental programs that we conduct here in the county. We've had a number of successes through our Chesapeake Bay Preservation Program and the assistance that we provide to homeowners. We have a number of successful cases, for example, in the lake communities where we have worked with homeowners to improve their yards, for example, where they back up to one of the lakes, and we're able to actually assist the homeowner in developing a nice product while still meeting the regulatory requirements of the Chesapeake Bay Act. And in fact, we, both the county and certain homeowners, have actually won conservation awards for those efforts. And I think that's something that the board can be proud of. All that's to say, as I stated earlier, that one of the premises of the plan is that properly done development and resource preservation can go hand in hand and work together. And that, again, if properly done, the county can be a leader and achieve the best of both worlds through its planning programs. And with that, I'll answer any questions that the board may have.
Board members have any questions of Mr. Fincham?
I have none.
Mr. Thomas?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fincham, in your Chapter 3 discussion on housing,
Yes, sir.
there's a definition for affordability as being the purchase price of 3 times the household income. And where did that particular metric come from?
Let me restate that figure.
Okay.
The measure is that the price of a house should not exceed 30% of the household income. So that may be a typo that I need to go back and look at. But in terms of purchasing a house, okay, the amount of your income that is devoted to housing should not be more than 30% of your monthly income.
Okay. Let me just...
Which, if you look... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. It was going to take me a minute to click through the numbers, but go ahead.
Which I was going to say might be a reverse way of what you just said, but...
Yeah, I'm just reading what's here. It says,
right.
Purchase price 3 times household income defines affordability, and if I'm right, I think the median income in Carolina is somewhere in the $50,000–$60,000 range household, if that high.
Actually, there are 2 figures. One is median household income. One's median family income. I believe the household income is just over $60,000, okay, and the median family income is just over $50,000.
Okay, so it was in the $50,000–$60,000 range. Then you're saying we'll use 50 because that might make the math easier. Then you're saying 30% of that 50, which would be $15,000
a year.
A year is what someone should be able to put towards a house.
Yes, sir. And that's the definite. That's defined by HUD as one standard for affordable housing.
Okay, so this is a HUD figure.
Yes.
Or a HUD formula. So if I've taken $15,000 from my $50,000 household income, I can roughly pay $1,100, $1,200 a year for a mortgage, a month for a mortgage, which would probably get me in the...
Probably a little over $12,000.
A little over $12,000,
Yes.
which would get me in like a $300,000 house.
No, if your average annual income is $50,000, and 30% of it, or not more than 30% of that, which is roughly a third, okay?
15.
Multiply by 3 would equate to roughly $150,000 house. 3 times your average, your household income. If the household's $50,000, 3 times of that would be about $150,000 house.
Okay, you just switched the figures on me. You said it
No,
was
but
30%.
I think we're talking the same. The one figure was 3 times the household income.
Right.
3 times 50 is 150.
Okay.
If you work it the other way, 30% of your $50,000 annual income going to housing is about $15,000 a year, and based upon the median price of a house would equal, back when we calculated those numbers, would equal $150,000, $160,000 house.
Okay. And the reason I'm kind of being a little bit anal about this is we have had several developers come to us, and we have asked for a certain percentage of affordable houses.
Yes, sir.
And my opinion of affordable and the developer's opinion of affordable have never been close. So if we're going to use this as our standard and our measure, probably when we get developers that come to the county and say, I can give you 10% at $200,000, they're not really satisfying what the county's real affordable housing need is.
I think that's a correct analysis. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. That's the one there I was really talking about. And because you're saying in the statement above that, you're saying the housing supply is predominantly single-family detached, I take it that there will be a push for townhouses or something of that nature to satisfy the need for first-time buyers and maybe future retirees?
I think with the plans that the board has approved, it offers more of a housing mix in the county than what we previously saw. So I think many of the projects that you've already approved, as they develop, will address some of these concerns.
Have some sort of component like that in them?
Yes, sir. Now,
Okay.
I don't want to suggest that we will have a run-up in the price of housing anytime soon.
Oh, I don't
Okay?
think we will, yeah.
What we saw was even what might otherwise be considered affordable units, there was a rapid escalation in the cost of that type of housing as well, which was market-driven.
Right. Okay. Then the other thing, though, is if we are to focus or make an attempt to address the needs of younger first-time buyers or future retirees, we would probably have some inherent issues with densities, because by definition a townhouse has a much larger density than the same amount of single-family houses.
Yes, sir. But again, I think you have addressed one of the recent policies of the board has been to encourage mixed-use developments.
Right.
We've gotten away from the separation of single-family detached from townhouses, from other types of multifamily, and we've actually gone towards mixed-use developments. And in the projects that you have approved, that mix of uses has included higher density for townhouses or other types of multifamily, condominiums, apartments, etc. So I think the board, through its actions, has recognized that mixed use is better than segregation of housing, and has tried to address that issue through the types of projects that you have approved.
Okay, but since this is specifically a new chapter for the comp plan, it's going to have more impact for future development, and I want to make sure I understand that there is a possibility for much denser development to satisfy the requirements that we're talking about here. And I just want to make sure I'm clear, because what we did before is not going to be covered by this new comp plan once the new comp plan's, I guess, approved, but everything afterwards. Like if we approve this tonight, which we're not, but if we were to approve this tonight and we got a development the next board meeting, we would be looking at that particular development in a totally different light than we ever looked before. Theoretically, of course.
Yes, you would be looking at it in the context of the adopted plan at that time. Housing, I feel the need to go one step further. The housing chapter in and of itself, I don't think it's correct to simply look at the housing chapter and the issues outlined here, okay? You have other chapters of the plan. For example, back in chapter 1, Life in Caroline, there was a discussion about housing or lot supply in the county. And I had stated to the board on a number of occasions, there is a significant inventory of zoned lots that are not yet built on, that if you simply look at that figure, addresses, in theory, our housing needs for a fairly significant period of time.
Right.
So my point is, I think you need to look at all those factors together. Housing characteristics is an issue to consider. That is one of several issues and should not be considered by itself.
Okay, and that's kind of what I wanted to make sure, because the next developer that stands in your place is going to say, I've done everything that's in the comp plan, and it could conceivably be a density that the board has never considered before, nor would like to consider. But
yes, sir. And jumping ahead to Chapter 8, which is the land use chapter.
Right.
Several years ago, in a plan update, we included some growth management strategies in that chapter. Those strategies are there and have been enhanced to make sure that those growth management strategies and policies are considered as part of a zoning process. For example, you have the Ladysmith area plan, you have the Carmel Church area plan, you have the Bowling Green Milford plan, Port Royal and Dawn. You have all these area plans which have their own phasing plans individually as part of that area planning process. What allows the board to look at those area plans and their consistency with the overall plan are the growth management strategies and policies in Chapter 8. So each plan, while it is specific to how that area desires to be developed, has to be evaluated in the context of the overall land use plan and the growth management strategies, which gives the board the flexibility to look at those future zoning applications, not only based on the sub-area plan, but whether it meets the growth rate strategies that the board has adopted.
okay, okay. I think we understand each other. Thank you, sir.
No questions at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for the report. All right, Mr. Fincham, we'll move along to the comprehensive plan revision, and I'm sure when it's all said and done, there'll be a lot of questions before it's approved. Okay, moving on to the next item is the proposed adoption of emergency ordinance to amend chapters 92 and 112 of the Code of Caroline County to extend the time for collection of utility availability fees. Mr. Mitchell?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, you have a memo in your packet concerning this issue, which was raised at the last Board of Supervisors meeting. At that meeting, Mr. Akers and the board directed staff to go back and look at options that might be available to the board to assist the housing industry during the current market conditions that are facing the housing industry. The board asked that we look at a couple of specific items, which we have done. One would be to modify the time at which we collect the utility availability fees for water and sewer. The current ordinance requires those fees to be collected at the issuance of a building permit. And we discussed perhaps amending that time frame to allow those fees to be actually collected at a later date. We threw out the idea of at the time of the issuance or setting the utility meters or 90 days, whichever would occur first. You have that recommendation in this report to the board. We've also suggested that since that is a public hearing process, to amend those ordinances, that if the board desires, that you could adopt an emergency ordinance specifically related to the availability fees, which would have to be followed by a public hearing. I believe it's within 30 days, Mr. Emerson, in which you would have to make those changes permanent in order for that ordinance to continue to be effective. So you have that in your packet as well. One of the other issues that was discussed was the possibility of deferring the collection of cash proffers to that same time. Not deferring cash proffers altogether or the collection of those proffers altogether, but deferring the actual collection of the proffers to the same time that we collect the utility availability fees. There are two options for the board. Number one, a developer or applicant could actually come into the board, request that proffer amendment, which would go through the normal process of a public hearing at the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors. The General Assembly has adopted some legislation recently which would allow the board to waive the public hearing requirement if the proffer or applicant requests a change and the board deems that it is not, and Ben, you can help me with the correct language, but if it's not a change in use or density. So, for example, the board could consider a request to defer the collection of a proffer from the time of the issuance of a building permit to some future date without the going through the full zoning amendment process if the board acted on that request. We've also outlined that option in here for the board to consider if you so desire. Again, the main issue there would be time savings, not necessarily cost savings to the applicant. You could, in theory, waive or defer one public hearing on that matter, which might save some time, and everybody says time is money. With that, I'll answer any questions that the board has.
I see the county attorney is discussing with the county administrator. Is it something we all need to know, Mr. Emerson? No, okay. Does the board have any questions about what Mr. Fincham is sharing with the board?
Yes, Mr. Fincham, if I remember right, the reasoning behind some of these folks asking that is because of some of the loan issues they have with their construction loans and that kind of thing, and that would help them get their projects going a little quicker. Is that right?
Yes, sir. One of the concerns expressed by contractors is the timing of their construction loans and the amount of those loans and when they can pull down certain parts of those loans.
So their draws, basically.
Their draws, it's easier for them to cover the material cost, et cetera, and the cost of the availability fee later in the process instead of up front. Okay. Mr. Borshuk and I have discussed that issue. It's not uncommon for fees to be, the availability fees to be collected at a time other than the issuance of the permit. And Mr. Borshuk is here to answer any utility-related questions concerning those options.
I think I have another question. Can we use this also as sort of a billing issue? In other words, what I'm getting at is if there's things that we want to take care of at that time that maybe the applicant hasn't provided us with, this would kind of give us some leeway to go back and say, okay, we have to do some extra billing on X, Y, and Z, or whatever issue may come up. If you understand what I'm trying to get to.
John, I'm going to ask you to come forward. I'm not sure that it necessarily gives us any more ability to collect additional billings.
Okay.
But I'll ask John to.
And I guess specifically what I'm referring to when I was working for the town, sometimes we'd have builders come in and they'd put their stuff in, because we had them put in the meters, or at least the meter boxes, and sometimes they'd put them in an area and then they'd come through and do their development. When they did that, those meter boxes would be, inevitably, a lot of them would be in the wrong height or whatever, so we couldn't even get our meters in them. So I'm thinking that we may be able to use this to kind of hold it over their head a little bit if they don't comply with us. I don't know if that's possible or not.
I don't know if that necessarily has to be specifically addressed in the fees and when they're collected. As far as setting meters in many jurisdictions that I'm familiar with, if what is provided to set the meter is not correct, then the meter doesn't get set.
Yes.
And if it doesn't get set, then the house cannot go to settlement.
Okay.
So
I guess what I'm getting at is if we go out there to set the meter, we're going to collect that money no matter what, and we can kind of say, you know, if you don't have it right, we're not going to set your meter, and you're still paying us, is what I'm getting at, I guess.
yes.
Okay. We would also hit them with an impact fee when they do stuff like that too. So.
You have a question, Mr. Popowitz?
That's all I had, Mr.
Mr. Thomas?
Yeah. Well, let's see. Mr. Fincham stated in his memo here, you know, a good point in that he says it's basically in the county's best interest to have some development as opposed to none, which, you know, is probably true. And I don't want to. I guess I don't want to think in pre-housing market crash terms, because sometimes we've got to say if we did it one way before the economy went bad, we've got to totally throw that out, and whatever we did before doesn't work, so we've got to do something different. And I'm willing to look at this. I'm just not quite convinced yet that this is where we should go, because I know the county's got its own liabilities. We just said we were going to upgrade the wastewater treatment plant. We need X amount of connections per year to make that upgrade go well. As we delay collection, is that going to cause us a problem? But if we don't have any development, we're not going to have any collections. So the two of those are kind of hand in hand. I'm looking at whatever we can do to stimulate it, stimulate the housing market. I'm just wondering if we do this, how's that going to affect all the houses that we have now that are actually built and empty? You know, we've still got a lot of foreclosed units in all the big subdivisions, I'm sure. And we're talking about adding new inventory, basically, when we've got a lot of those. And that's not a question you can answer. That's just me kind of wrestle with the subject and think out loud. So I'm willing to look at this. I'm not quite sure this is, you know, right just yet, but I need to look at it with a new, fresh attitude to see if it is. The proffer part, I'm not sure I'm willing to go that far in doing proffers or not letting them pay for proffers until later. At least it's more of a statement than a question. So I appreciate your time working on this.
Mr. Seeley?
Yeah, I have a couple questions, and maybe more statements and questions, but I'm a little confused by, is also recommended the amending the zoning ordinance to allow the board to negotiate proffers at public hearings without the requirement to re-advertise the hearing, and the ability to amend previously accepted proffers without the need to go back to public hearing. And, you know, the whole proffer deal gets knocked out during the rezoning. And I don't know that the Planning Commission gets cut out of this process at this point or not, but they've worked on this, we've worked on this. I'm not sure that I'm willing, matter of fact, I know I'm not willing to go back and revisit proffers to stimulate. As far as collecting utility fees, I understand that this is about 75% of the developer's cost, the connection fees are, in terms of what they have to put out, and the cash profit of the county. And I can see some of that being paid upon meters being set, but I'm not sure I'm willing to go the whole 9 yards on that yet either, because I'm not convinced it's in our best interest. So, Mr. Fincham, can you talk a little bit about the zoning ordinance and the negotiation of proffers and not having to go back to public hearing with them?
Yes, sir. One of the changes in the state enabling legislation is I think the General Assembly has recognized over the years that the conditional zoning language was fairly tight and didn't leave the board a lot of negotiating room once a public hearing was commenced at the board level. There are several, I guess, recent examples in the last year where this board negotiated with the developer during the process, and where it was deemed that it was a material or significant change, had to go back to public hearing. That would not necessarily change. But a strict interpretation of the legislation could be that once the public hearing has started, that you don't have much room to negotiate proffers at all. The legislation was specifically amended to give the board some additional flexibility. And Ben, I think the language is where it does not materially change. I've got it here. Okay. The governing body may also accept amended proffers once the public hearing has begun if the amended proffers do not materially affect the overall proposal. Now, again, to me, that's a little subjective. What is materially affects the zoning application? But the intent of that language was to give the board, I think, some additional flexibility in terms of negotiating proffers once a hearing has begun. Because we were looking at the other provision of the state code, which says that related to the board waiving the public hearing, we felt that since that was in the same section of the conditional zoning, that it made sense to go ahead and incorporate that should you refer that to the Planning Commission for review and recommendation, which of course would require a public hearing.
I guess I'm looking at the short time that I've been here and the number of rezonings and proffers that we've heard, and I'm not sure that I'm willing to say, okay, let's start to relook at those, because there's been an economic downturn. As those have been passed, those have been, and I may be wrong in my interpretation, I'll give you that, but the way I read this is the proffers can be changed, and it's very subjective into what the impact will be.
It does not automatically mean proffers can be changed. An applicant still has to come back and request a proffer amendment, which is in effect a zoning amendment. You've already accepted proffered conditions, which becomes part of the zoning of that property. To amend the proffers is a rezoning or an amendment to that previously approved zoning. They still have to go through that process. So they would still have to make application for a zoning amendment, and would still go through the process to the Planning Commission and ultimately to the Board of Supervisors. Your flexibility is whether you require a public hearing at the board level for those proffered, for the amendments that they're requesting to the proffers. So it saves the developer a little time. I think Mr. Thomas was correct in, or you were correct in the percentages that you gave. The cash proffer figure is a relatively small number in terms of the overall cost to a developer. But if the board desires, it would provide you with some flexibility as to whether you wanted to help with the timing of a proffer amendment. That's what it would essentially do. And it's under that context that you could consider an application by a developer to amend the timing of the proffers. Let me also say they've got that ability right now. They simply have to go through the process, but there's nothing to keep a developer right now from coming back in and requesting an amendment to their proffer package.
But
you don't, in neither case are you obligated to approve it.
Are we required to have a public hearing?
Right now, yes, you would be.
And if we change this, we would not be?
You would have to make a determination that a public hearing was not necessary. They would have to actually request that the board waive that public hearing process. And you are not obligated to approve that.
So for example, if I can help with Mr. Seeley, we've got a developer who says he's going to give us $10,000 per house. He's building X number of houses. During the public comment section, we think that he should give us $15,000, and I'm just throwing out numbers. Under normal circumstances, we would then have to hold a second public hearing, because that's probably drastically changing. Or maybe he's going to give us $15,000 and X different, because that's the way we worked before. Right?
Yes, but I'm not convinced that this means you can, I'm not convinced that you can do that at the first public hearing stage. What I think